What is happening here today at the UN Human Rights Council is not new. In fact, there has been a deep and persistent problem with UN bodies from New York to Geneva when they address accusations, let me add false accusations, that Israel is violating the basic norms of international law. Having served as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations in New York back in the 1990s, I witnessed this phenomenon from the very first day I walked into that blue-green building on First Avenue. I was confronted at the time with an effort to convene what are called the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention, that is, its signatories, to take measures against Israel for alleged violations of that convention. It had been adopted after World War II in order to protect civilians in times of war. Israel was a signatory. The first question I felt that I needed to ask was, when had the signatories been ever convened before? Were they convened when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan? No. What about when Iraq went into Iran? No. What about the invasion of Kuwait? High contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention didn't meet. Turkey into Cyprus? No again. Maybe Libya going into Chad? No convening of the Fourth Geneva Convention signatories? No way. In fact, in repeated cases of outright aggression, this body of the high contracting parties had never been brought together before. But now, the UN General Assembly was considering to convene them in the sole case of Israel. Why? Because of the territories it had captured 30 years earlier in the 1967 Six-Day War. Moreover, the UN's focus on the singular case of Israel really stood out. Back in 1967, and people either don't know this, forget it, or both the Security Council and the General Assembly had rejected Soviet efforts to brand Israel as the aggressor in the Six-Day War. It was clear as day at the time that Israel had captured the West Bank and Gaza Strip in a war of self-defense after neighboring countries from Egypt to Iraq massed their armies along its borders. But that fundamental fact did not deter the UN in 1997, when I was there, from treating Israel like it was the worst international criminal. This biased treatment of Israel continued in subsequent years. After Israel implemented the Oslo Accords with the Palestine Liberation Organization during the 1990s and withdrew its military government from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel faced a wave of escalating terror attacks that emanated from the very cities from which it had pulled out. These terror attacks specifically were aimed at innocent civilians and not military targets. City buses began exploding in the heart of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and in other population centers. In March 2002, a Palestinian suicide bomber detonated himself at a Passover Seder in Netanya. Israel finally had to act to bring the bombings decisively to a halt, even if that meant going back into those West Bank cities that had become springboards for these attacks. Western militaries had well-developed military doctrines for putting down this kind of urban warfare. Their military manuals, which we checked, spoke about utilizing air power, artillery, and even flamethrowers to flush out urban guerrillas. There were states that used carpet bombing to blanket whole areas. The Russians used such tactics in Chechnya, and we saw them again just now in Syria. But Israel refused to employ what may have been commonly used by others. In the West Bank town of Jenin, known by the Palestinians themselves as, quote, the capital of the suicide bombers, Israel decided to send in its ground forces in house-to-house combat. A fierce battle ensued. Saeb Erekat, the Palestinian spokesman who was sitting in Jericho, peddled the false claim that Israeli forces in Jenin had engaged in a massacre of Palestinians. The truth was that Israel had sent in reserve units so that many of the soldiers killed on the Israeli side in Jenin were fathers and husbands. And how did the UN reply? The spokesman of the UN specialized agencies asserted in the international media, quote, Israel had lost all moral ground in this conflict, unquote. A conclusion, by the way, that was adopted by the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which he subsequently had to retract. The UN ultimately admitted that the numbers of fatalities in Jenin was far smaller than it had originally claimed. But a pattern of unsubstantiated accusations, followed by belated and irrelevant retractions, had been set. What did the UN have to say to the widows and to the orphans of the soldiers who died in Jenin so that Palestinians would be protected? You know what? It was the UN that lost the moral high ground in Jenin, not Israel. This brings us to the UN Human Rights Council in 2009, which has a long history of anti-Israel bias. And this was demonstrated yet again after Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2006. It was hoped at that time that an Israeli withdrawal from contested territory would reduce the hostile intent of the Palestinian terror organizations, like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, which had been firing rockets into Israeli towns in recent years. But the exact opposite occurred. The number of rockets fired into Israeli towns shot up, increased from 179 to 946, a 500% increase after the Israeli withdrawal. Again, Israel was forced to act in its own self-defense. Here in Geneva, the Human Rights Council established a fact-finding mission that's well known, headed by Justice Richard Goldstone of South Africa, to investigate Israeli military operations. The result was a report about 500 pages in length, which was the most vicious indictment of the State of Israel, bearing the seal of the UN since Zionism is racism. The most outrageous charge it made was that Israel deliberately, let me repeat that again, deliberately killed civilians in Gaza. I was no longer in government, but when I was invited by an American university to debate Goldstone, the highest levels of the Israel Defense Forces provided me with all the material I needed to show how the core conclusions of the famous Goldstone report were baseless. How could Israel have a policy of deliberately killing civilians when it implemented the exact opposite policy of protecting them by issuing repeated warnings in Arabic to civilians that Israel was about to take imminent action? Beside leaflets, an Arabic-speaking IDF unit telephoned the homes where it was known that Hamas rockets had been stored. Israeli drones monitored if the target had been evacuated. If not, a special non-lethal munition was dropped. It was called a knock on the roof to convince those inside that this was serious. And only then was the target destroyed. Tell me, we're standing in front of the UN in Geneva. Who else does this? Who else issues these warnings in combat? Name another member of the United Nations. The Human Rights Council should be ashamed of itself for accusing Israel. The report of Justice Goldstone never addressed this. You know what happened? Goldstone subsequently retracted his most damning accusation in an opinion piece in the Washington Post. But the damage had been already done. The UN Human Rights Council already had voted to endorse the conclusions of the Goldstone report, although in typical UN fashion, its resolution only condemned Israel and did not even mention Hamas. Musa Abu Marzouk, the Hamas leader, quipped on Al Arabiya television network that Hamas had been acquitted by the UN. Do you believe that? The UN had given Hamas essentially a green light to continue their rocket attacks on Israel. There is a straight line from UN actions back then and last week's launch by Hamas of an Iranian Fajr missile toward Tel Aviv. Ultimately, however, Israel's position was vindicated, not by the UN, but by the United States through the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, who in 2014 countered the impression the UN had given by saying, and I quote, "I actually do think that Israel went through extraordinary lengths to limit collateral damage and civilian casualties," unquote. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States had the means to verify what he was saying. You think any serious verification is done over here in Geneva? Forget it. Now the UN wants to look at the Palestinian protests along the Gaza fence. How can anyone take the UN seriously when it has been shown, that when it comes to Israel, its reports have been highly politicized and seriously flawed? Is anyone looking after the human rights of Israeli farmers in the Gaza envelope communities whose fields are regularly set ablaze by Hamas incendiary weapons? Does anyone in Geneva even mention that it is the forces of Hamas that are beating the Palestinian population? You can see that on Palestinian television. I watched it this morning in my hotel room. To our north, as we speak, Hezbollah has militarized 200 Shiite villages south of the Litani in southern Lebanon and made them into a network for human shields in order to protect their Iranian-supplied missiles. and when Hezbollah constructs attack tunnels into Israeli territory, where is UNIFIL? That belongs to the UN. Where is UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that prohibits such Hezbollah activity? Is anybody saying anything? Let me make clear that it is demonstrated time and again that only Israel will defend itself by itself. Israel does not seek international forces to protect it. But it does expect one thing and one thing from the international community: the truth. That is today what Israel asks for, but when it comes to the UN, the truth has been extremely difficult to obtain. Thank you.